After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Imagine the morning in Washington begins with a shock. The U.S. Treasury Department receives data that makes your blood run cold. Japan, the second largest holder of U.S. bonds, is dumping tens of billions of dollars worth of securities in 1 month. Exchange rates are rattling. The bond market is shaking. This is not just an economic warning. This is a financial attack. Silent, but precise. The enemy doesn't use missiles, impose sanctions, or make noise on the UN podiums. He simply presses sell, and the world comes to a standstill.
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with...
But that's just the beginning. In recent months, a war has erupted in U.S.-Japan relations, unofficial but palpable in every American home. It all started with new tariffs. The White House decided to protect its own auto industry and imposed a 25% tax on Japanese parts and electric cars. The result: Toyota, Honda, and Nissan prices in America skyrocketed, sales plummeted, but Japan didn't protest on the sidelines. It made a move that made the walls of the Oval Office tremble. As Trump convenes an emergency meeting, Japanese factories are leaving the US. Production lines are being phased out and moved to Mexico and Southeast Asia. With each passing day, Japan's dependence on the US market diminishes, and with it, Washington's influence. But the main thing is ahead.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
According to insider reports, Tokyo is preparing a second strike. If the US continues its tariff pressure, Japan may impose a ban on exports of solid-state batteries, a key technology on which America's entire electrification program depends. This would jeopardize tens of billions in investments, disrupt supply chains, and effectively paralyze the development of the US EV sector. Meanwhile, another ally, Canada, is delivering an unexpected stab in the back. Oil and gas shipments to the US have been halted. The reason? Years of economic pressure from Washington. Canadians sign new contracts with China and India, and US states face rising electricity, fuel, and food prices. A new concept is emerging: energy winter. Empty gas stations, power outages, and there's more to come. Joining this economic storm is China. Retaliatory duties on US agricultural products, restrictions on exports of rare earth metals vital to the US military and electronics industries. A blow to the most vulnerable.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
What happens next? Will America give in or choose the path of confrontation? Are allies turning into strategic rivals? This is not just a set of news stories. This is the beginning of a global redistribution of economic power, and it's already affecting everyone, including you. The US and Japan have always been economic partners, but recent developments on trade are jeopardizing decades of stability and cooperation. The situation has become especially acute with Washington's tariff policy changes on Japanese cars and auto parts. It all started when the Trump administration decided to raise tariffs on auto parts coming into the US in 2023, particularly on components for electric cars. The 25% tariff imposed against Japanese manufacturers like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan might at first glance seem like part of an attempt to protect the US auto industry. In reality, however, it has become the catalyst for a deep economic divide. The tariff hike led to a sharp increase in the price of Japanese-branded vehicles in the US market, which in turn made consumers reluctant to buy, and Japanese automakers began to lose their competitiveness.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
In the first quarter of 2025, Japanese car sales in the United States fell by 7%. This would seem insignificant at first glance, but such a decline is a major blow to Japanese companies that have held a strong position in the US market for decades. At the same time, US automakers, such as Ford and General Motors, have begun to capitalize on the growing demand resulting from the government's protectionist measures. These companies began to attract more and more customers as the prices of their cars, despite certain fluctuations, remained relatively stable, unlike Japanese models, which rose significantly in price. Realizing that the increase in auto parts rates was just the tip of the iceberg, Japan began to develop its own response. Japanese companies such as Toyota, Honda, and Nissan began to lose profits and faced rising costs. Faced with falling sales and the threat of higher car prices, Japanese manufacturers began to think about how to minimize the impact. Japanese analysts say the decision to raise US tariffs was a targeted blow to one of Japan's key industries and could significantly weaken its position in the international market. Japanese auto plants in the US faced a sharp decline in profits, and most companies were forced to reconsider their strategic plans for the future. Japan decided to respond to this aggression. At first, it was strange to see how the Japanese government not only limited itself to harsh rhetoric, but also started taking measures that had a strong impact on the US economy. In 2025, it was revealed that Japan began a massive sell-off of US treasuries. Japan was the second largest holder of US debt, holding over $1.1 trillion. In February 2025, Japan sold $30 billion worth of bonds. This was done for a reason. The bond sale weakened the US dollar and caused the country's interest rates to rise, putting additional financial pressure on the US economy. The move not only emphasized Japan's determination to respond to trade sanctions, but also demonstrated its willingness to use its financial strength to confront Washington.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Realizing the danger of the situation, the US government began to mobilize its economic forces in an attempt to mitigate the consequences. However, Japan's financial strategy was highly risky. A move such as selling off treasury bonds could have long-term consequences for both sides. The moment the dollar weakened, interest rates began to rise and the cost of credit for US companies and households increased. This meant that the US economy would come under pressure from rising inflation, which would hit consumers especially hard, as goods imported from abroad would become more expensive. But Japan went further. While US manufacturers were struggling, Japanese auto plants began moving some production from the US to Mexico and Southeast Asia. This allowed Japanese companies to minimize the impact of tariffs and maintain their competitive advantage in the US market. Japanese firms such as Toyota and Honda began to build new plants in Mexico, where labor was cheaper and new tax and customs laws did not threaten unnecessary protectionist tariffs. There was also a marked increase in investment in Southeast Asian countries, such as Vietnam and Thailand, where market conditions for Japanese companies were more favorable. These moves were part of a strategy to reduce dependence on the US market and mitigate possible trade blows from the United States. Relations between the two countries began to change, all against a backdrop of growing tensions in the global economy. US protectionist policies were endangering not only Japanese manufacturers, but also international investors who began to be cautious about the US market. China, as well as other Asian powers such as South Korea and India, began to keep a close eye on the situation, as such economic turmoil could affect all global trade. And so, amidst these developments, Japan has moved to even more drastic measures. In response to possible further tariff hikes on cars and auto parts, Japan began threatening to restrict exports of high-tech goods, including solid-state batteries, which were at the peak of technological advances in electric vehicles. With tensions rising, Japan and the US were on the verge of a new trade conflict that could affect not only the auto industry, but the entire technology sector, including the energy and electronics manufacturing fields. A Japanese threat to block exports of key technologies, particularly in the area of electric vehicle batteries, could have a knock-on effect on the future of the US auto industry, hindering an accelerated transformation toward electrification and stifling the development of domestic production in the United States.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Thus, overt confrontations and covert economic strikes have become the main tools of struggle in the strained relations between the two countries. Japan may now retaliate by starting to play with high interest rates, putting additional strain on the global economy. The question, which of these giants will be the first to give in or, on the contrary, continue escalating the conflict, no longer seems so obvious. After Japan made its first economic move in response to US trade sanctions, the question of how far its strategy will go has become even more urgent. Shifting production capacity to Mexico and Southeast Asia was an important element of the strategy to minimize the impact of tariffs, but it was only the beginning. Japan began to more actively seek ways to strengthen its financial and technological independence from the United States, and its actions went far beyond simply responding to economic pressures. Japan was not only adapting to the changed conditions, but was also beginning to construct new strategies that could significantly alter the global economic balance. Over the next few months, Japanese corporations began to invest not only in production capacity, but also in infrastructure, in order to reduce their dependence on the US market and diversify their export channels. This was especially true for major Japanese companies such as Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, which began building new plants in countries with more favorable conditions for production, such as Mexico, Vietnam, and Indonesia. As a result, the share of Japanese cars in the US market began to fall even further. In the first quarter of 2025, according to reports, sales of Japanese brands in the US fell 10%. At the same time, US automakers, such as Ford and General Motors, continued to increase sales, attracting the attention of buyers looking to avoid the high cost of Japanese models. This was confirmed by a wave of new investments in expanding production capacity and strengthening their position in the electric car market. The US protectionist policy focused on supporting local manufacturers significantly spurred this process, but Japan realized that if it did not go further and did not take decisive measures in response, it could bring it to the brink of economic isolation, which in the long run would be a threat to its global position.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
That is why Japan began to prepare a second wave of retaliatory measures, which turned out to be much more serious. One of the most important strategic steps was to limit exports of high-tech components such as solid-state batteries. Japanese companies Toyota and Honda, as world leaders in electric vehicle technology, realizing their key role in this sector, began to think through pressure mechanisms that could paralyze the development of the American electric vehicle industry. The American industry, heavily dependent on Japanese technologies, especially in the field of batteries for electric cars, risked finding itself in a situation where its growth would simply slow down, if not stop. In addition, Japan was beginning to aggressively increase its share in other global markets. Going beyond Mexico and Southeast Asia, Japanese companies began to expand their presence in Europe and Africa. Cooperation with the European Union became strategically important for Japan, as the EU itself was interested in strengthening economic interaction with Tokyo against the backdrop of global political instability. One of the key steps was the creation of new trade agreements between Japan and the EU, which greatly expanded the market for Japanese cars and technology. These agreements allowed Japanese cars to penetrate European markets unimpeded, bypassing many of the restrictions and barriers of trade wars. In addition, Japan did not limit itself only to the economic impact on the US, but began to think seriously about creating economic alliances that could weaken the influence of the US economy on the world market. The transfer of some production facilities and the introduction of new technologies in markets such as India and China allowed Japanese companies to reduce the risks associated with US protectionist policies. These steps demonstrated that Japan was not only protecting its interests, but was also trying to create alternative trade and production routes that would not depend on the United States. Japan's retaliatory measures were not limited to just economic pressure, but went to a new level, touching on technology, energy, and even military issues. Japan began restricting exports of rare earth elements, which are essential for the production of advanced semiconductors and military technology, such as chips for radar and satellites. This was a blow to US strategic interests, which depended heavily on Japanese supplies of these critical materials. In addition, Japan began making deals with Chinese companies for rare earth materials, which reduced its dependence on the US and strengthened its position in the global rare earth market. At the same time, the threat of economic isolation for the US was becoming more and more real. The transfer of technologies and production capacities to new markets led to the fact that America began to lose not only in the automotive industry, but also in high-tech industries. The US was under pressure not only from Japan, but also from other countries that began to develop their own industries and reduce their economic ties with Washington. Elon Musk's political statements, his support for the far-right AfD party in Germany, his involvement in the Brexit discussions and his interference in the British elections have sparked a flurry of criticism. One after another, European media outlets refused advertising contracts with Tesla. In February, the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter, for the first time in 3 years, removed the company's advertising block from its pages, citing ethical contradictions. Against this background, Chinese manufacturers BYD Neo began to expand aggressively into Europe. Their models were cheaper, more technologically advanced, and offered with flexible payment programs. While Tesla maintained a premium price tag, competitors offered electric cars 25 to 30% cheaper, but with similar features. The BYD was particularly successful, overtaking the Model 3 in sales in Spain and France in March. In the UK, Neo signed a contract with the government to supply a fleet of vehicles for public services, officially beating Tesla in the tender. So the pressure on Tesla has been twofold, from politicians and from competitors. Musk, being in the midst of several crises at once, chose an attack strategy, public statements, threats of lawsuits, attempts to reorganize the business model. But according to observers, even he could not help but feel that the familiar landscape was crumbling. What seemed eternal, Tesla's dominance in the world of electric cars, its unique role in the state agenda, turned out to be fragile. And increasingly the question was being asked, was Tesla facing the most serious threat in its history? The impact of the Canadian crisis on Tesla was just the tip of the iceberg. The real blow came from the other side, from Europe, where the sales situation has already deteriorated to tier first 2 months of 2025. Where Tesla used to be the flagship of the electric car revolution, it is now being squeezed out both politically and commercially. New car registrations nearly halved in January and February, down 47%, and the company's European market share fell to 1.4%, down from more than 3% a year ago. Markets considered reliable, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, became a zone of losses. In France, according to an internal report from the Transportation Sustainability Agency, Tesla sales fell 61% in 1 quarter. In Britain, Where the Model S was once the best-selling premium electric model, it sold just 98 cars in January, 5 times less than the Neo's equivalent figure. The reasons were not just numbers, but also image. The situation around Elon Musk played a key role. His open support of far-right politicians, his participation in discussions on European migration policy, and his repeated statements against green bigotry put the company in a difficult position. Environmental organizations, including Greenpeace Europe and Germany's Deutsche Umwelt, announced a boycott of Tesla, arguing that the company has lost its moral right to represent the future of sustainable energy. This was accompanied by a sharp decline in corporate partnerships. Europe's largest leasing company, Autobridge, refused to buy Tesla cars, replacing its entire fleet with Chinese and German electric models. Against the backdrop of falling sales and deteriorating reputation on the European continent, Tesla failed to maintain its position in the United States. In January 2025, new registrations fell by 11% compared to the same month last year. The Model 3 and Model S saw a particularly strong drop, minus 17.4% and 31.2%, respectively. Even the Model X, which was previously seen as the company's flagship SUV, was losing ground. Sales fell to 12,000 units, which hasn't happened since its launch. According to the analytical platform Autoscope, the main reason was the growing competition from Hyundai, Ford and Rivian, which actively developed the service infrastructure and staked on a more flexible pricing policy. At the same time, Tesla, despite the decline in demand, refused to revise prices for a long time, relying on the strength of the brand. In reality, many consumers preferred less scandalous alternatives. But perhaps the most alarming signal was the behavior of investors. The company's shares went down immediately after Canada's announcement, and although there was a temporary 12% rise on March 25th, a reaction to rumors of a possible legal victory in an international arbitration, by the end of the week the stock started to fall again. On March 27th, they fell to $272, losing 5.6% in one day. Moreover, within 2 weeks after the scandal in Canada, Tesla's capitalization fell by $48 billion. Reports from JP Morgan and Citi warned, investing in Tesla at the current stage carries high political and strategic risk. Some funds, including the Norwegian government pension fund Global, began to wind down their positions. Against the background of these processes, there were rumors about the possibility of delisting the company from several European stock exchanges, unofficially because of regulatory risks and image conflict. In the international arena, meanwhile, a different kind of pressure was building up.